Wonderful. Well, it is my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. Great to see everybody, and thanks for spending your Monday night with us. My name is Alan Frosch. I'm a co-owner and chief community officer here at Tattered Cover. It is beyond a pleasure to introduce Phil Weiser, our partner on this event and our moderator tonight. It is a pleasure to call you our Attorney General, and personally, it's great to call you a friend. So Phil, thank you so much for being here. The floor is yours.
Outstanding. This is a special opportunity for me because I've got two rock stars who have thought deep, long, and hard on how we improve our criminal justice system, which is one of the most pressing issues of our time. I would be remiss not to note tomorrow, it's the 1-year anniversary of the killing of George Floyd. We'll talk about that murder and the conversations it sparked. We're in a moment where criminal justice issues are deservedly getting a lot of attention and discussion. If everybody who participated in this discussion read Rachel's book, it would be a better discussion. Rachel Barkow is a professor and vice dean, I take it, at the NYU School of Law, my alma mater, an extraordinary person, a Denver native who has thought longer and harder about these issues than almost any other academic one can name. Denise Myers is the, I'm going to call it policy director, is that the right title, Denise, of the ACLU, but she's so much more than that. She's worked for now President Biden, is a nationwide leader. The law that Colorado passed after the murder of George Floyd, Senate Bill 217, reflected just one of her many contributions to a public policy discourse that has made our state more just, more fair, and work to improve a criminal justice system where, again, we have lots of areas that would benefit from more rigorous, honest conversation. And that's the goal of tonight. And that's the Tattered Cover. For those of you who are joining us, you know what the Tattered Cover stands for, and you appreciate Alan as a steward of that incredible Denver institution. Rachel has been to many independent bookstores across the US, and I think her Twitter note called Tattered Cover her favorite, or at least one of her very favorite independent bookstores. Please join me in celebrating this Denver institution. And I thank you, Alan, and the Tattered Cover for hosting a conversation. I'm gonna be both adding in, but then also asking questions. And most importantly, we're gonna wanna get to your questions and thoughts. There is obviously a Q&A that is available for your open questions. We'll work to get those in the mix. Rachel, I'm gonna start off with sentencing reform, in part because of how much time you've spent on this issue. You were a member of the US Sentencing Commission. Let me start off with one of the most glaring sentencing failures of the modern era, which is the different approach of crack cocaine versus cocaine. And most people would say, if you're being honest, the only difference is who is the purchaser of crack cocaine and who's the purchaser of cocaine. And was the penalty for possession of one 10x the penalty of the other? Was that basically right, Rachel?
Yeah. Yeah.
With very little justification. That is only one. It's a glaring example, but it is an example of how we've had a sentencing system that defies rational justification. So can you talk a little about challenges in sentencing and how we better reform a sentencing system that is unfortunately possessing mistakes and problems like this one?
Yeah, and I think that's a good story to kind of shed some light on how it goes wrong. When crack comes on the scene, it's touted as this new dangerous drug. There's never been anything like it. And there's a star basketball recruit out of the University of Maryland. He's, drafted first by the Boston Celtics, Len Bias, and he dies of a heart attack, and people think it's a crack overdose, and it's kind of like the height of hysteria. And in the midst of all this, Congress is deciding what to do, and really quickly, with no evidence, no experts, no analysis, nothing, decides that the penalties for crack cocaine, you would need 10 times the quantity of powder cocaine to get the same sentence. So, enormous quantities of powder would be equivalent to crack. And you get mandatory minimum sentences for just possessing crack cocaine. And it's all because of this hysteria that this is this new, dangerous, awful drug. And there's really nothing that puts the brakes on that process. It's just like, we've got to do something about it. Now, it emerges pretty quickly that sentencing differential is racially disparate. That by and large, the people who are arrested for selling and using and possessing crack are largely Black Americans, whereas powder was more likely to be a white American using that drug, right? And so the racial disparities become obvious pretty quickly. Congress still doesn't do anything. Then there's reports that come out that actually chemically the drugs are identical. There is no difference. It may have been a new drug, but it has the same effect on your body. So there's no pharmacological difference. There's no difference in terms of, does it make people violent? And so all this comes out and Congress doesn't do anything for decades, even though we see, thousands and thousands of Black men get sent to prison for this drug that's indistinguishable from powder. And so it's finally in 2010, so about 25 years later, Congress alters it a little bit and makes the ratio slightly less awful. And it was 100-to-1 ratio, by the way. So they go from 101 to 18-to-1. But they don't change it retroactively. So there's still people sitting in prison who are serving those old long crack sentences. They get no relief. And it wasn't until about a year and a half ago that finally Congress gave some retroactive relief to folks. So if you think about that, that's like a 30-year saga where we knew within a couple of years that it was insane, but nothing could be done about it. We knew about the racial disparities, and we knew it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't helping with the demand for the drug, the supply for the drug. It just had no public safety benefit and nothing could be done. And so to me, that's just a microcosm of how we deal with drug policy, how we deal with all kinds of crimes. There's kind of a media hysteria around something and a rush by politicians to look like they're doing something, but no actual study to see, is it effective? What's our best approach? What might be the way to deal with these things? And, you can see that we're starting to see it now, right? There's the news reports are starting, homicides are up in cities around the country. What do we do? And, no analysis to why that might be, what might be the relationship between that and the pandemic or various other things, just a kind of mad rush to do something. And that something is almost always, well, let's lengthen some sentence, let's do something. And that's the story of American sentencing, kind of in a nutshell. And you could pick almost any drug, you could pick almost any crime issue, and we see it time and time again. And it's just really hard to break that political environment. Media is partly to blame, but our politicians are too. And so I think going forward, what we really need to try to do is bring some rationality into this, really ask what works for public safety, what works for helping people who have drug addiction problems. And when you start to ask those questions, you get an entirely different answer than criminalizing and punishing and putting people in prison for long periods of time. You do a whole bunch of different things, but you really don't do that.
Denise, let's stick with sentencing reform. You are observing this in Colorado. We're taking a baby step on misdemeanor sentencing reform this year. There's a goal of looking at felony sentencing reform next year. As someone on the ground, how would you add to what Rachel said? I do have to, and I hate to ever do this, I hope I don't do it again, correct one thing Rachel said. Len Bias was the second pick in the draft. Brad Daugherty was the first pick in the 1986 draft. So, go ahead,
you would know that. That's great. First of all, thank you. Thank you for having me here. And I liked your post about this evening, Attorney General, by referencing as, the Tattered cover is this little treasure. And so this is pretty awesome. And Rachel, I hope you get that book signing here live in Denver. It'd be great to see you. I think everything that Rachel said is really right on the mark. And it is really interesting how a lot of the criminal penalties we have on the books are really reactive. And that's really their sole genesis. And I think here in the state of Colorado, I think what we're going to find out, we'll find this out in the next chapter, is that we've over felonized so many things. And it's at least a good thing that we're starting to look at misdemeanors and really start to see how desperate there are, that, certain misdemeanors that you think are really not that bad are on the same level of misdemeanor offenses that you think are really bad. And I think that just happens all the time because it's more reactive. We read a thing in the paper about somebody tampering with a dead body, and now all of a sudden we need a crime, we need a statute, and we need sentences associated with it. Otherwise we think these things go on, that there's no penalty at all and they go unpunished. And that's typically not the case. It's typically the case that there's already something on the books that would address that and cover that. But instead we just keep creating more and more and more offenses. I feel a little sorry for those that are reviewing the misdemeanor code, because that's a lot, because we got a lot of offenses on the books, and you got to scratch your head and wonder why.
The title of Rachel's book is Prisoner of Politics, Breaking the Cycle of Mass Incarceration. Rachel, I'm going to go to a question that comes from what you just said and Denise picked up on. You are quoted as saying, "It is hard to have a nuanced discussion of any policy issue that isn't distorted by sensationalized media accounts and politicians looking for a rhetorical edge on an opponent." One doesn't have to recall the Willie Horton ad with painful recollection to know what you're talking about, although that is another case in point. I would add to that the following challenge that we can visit about. How can you beat an emotional argument with rational data? There's a lot of behavioral psychology that underscores how hard that is. In other words, there's been studies where you give people evidence that would show the opposite of what their emotions lead them to believe, and it doesn't actually move them. It may actually entrench them. That's a formidable challenge for your agenda, which is fundamentally a data-driven agenda. Other than being despondent about this, what other suggestions or prescriptions do you have?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate out, what you need to get a political movement for change versus what kind of change you should ask for. So to get the political movement, you do need to capture the hearts and minds of voters to want to see something different. And I agree with you, you don't get there with data. Like, those aren't good campaign ads. It doesn't matter what kind of bar graph you use, right? That's not a successful one. But I think the key is that we have so over incarcerated in America that we now have 1 in 3 adults with a criminal record. We now have 1 out of every 2 people has a family member who's been incarcerated. So now this isn't data in the abstract. This is personal for, a huge chunk of America. And people who are personally affected by sentencing, by excessive criminalization, they know how bad this is, right? They see it doesn't work. And so that's why we're seeing across the country, at least in elections for things like district attorneys, the communities that know the problems well want to do something different. And so I do think there is some way to kind of break that logjam by personal experience where people know. I do think there's powerful narratives on the other side. I think when people learn about the treatment that we have of people who have long sentences or they're held pre-trial because they can't afford bail, that can help spark change. And then the key is the change itself. My hope is that the change is also institutional, so that instead of it being whatever emotional story happens to come up next, you put in some institutional changes so that we now have decision makers that have to look at data, right? So you can put in place actors and demand, hey, before you do X, you have to look at the data to make sure it's okay. And you can do that with sentencing commissions, or you could do that by changing your pretrial detention practices and getting rid of cash bail. You can make institutional fixes, but you're right, to do any of those things, the first thing you need to get is this voter desire for change. And that won't come from the data. It's going to come from emotionally feeling that something is wrong. But I think, if we learned anything in the past year with the racial justice protests, with really a renewed attention to all the racial disparities associated with how criminal law operates in America, we have a lot of people who really feel emotionally invested in changing things. And so, that's the optimistic take for what is going to get us that wedge to then think about changes. And then we make the institutional shifts.
Well, and a couple of points on that. Jared Kushner has said his commitment to working on what was called the First Step Act at the federal level, where he worked on with another NYU law grad, Hakeem Jeffries. The reason was his dad was in jail. And so he had personal experience in the criminal justice system. I also want to share, I'm going to put in the chat a testimony that I gave, because it's a story, but it also exemplifies the following proposition: a more fair and just criminal justice system a criminal justice system that better protects victims and a criminal justice system that protects public safety are not at odds with one another. You actually can have, we'll talk about pretrial later, or reentry, you can have smarter, effective changes that do all those things. Here's the example. Charles Battle's coming home from school and someone says, who's a crime victim, describes the person who is white and had a gray hoodie. The police find someone who's black with a black hoodie and brings it to the victim in an overly suggestive way and says, this is the person who you're looking for? And the individual says, sure. And then Charles Battle gets arrested. He's at the top of his high school class. He misses his high school graduation 6 months before the charges get dropped. That was not fair to have an unduly suggestive witness identification. It didn't actually protect public safety, and it wasn't fair to the victim. So fixing unduly suggestive witness identifications, which we've got a bill that is set to pass in Colorado that will do that, isn't anti-public safety. It isn't anti-victim. It's pro-protecting victims, pro-protecting public safety, and fair to defendants who might otherwise be involved. And there's lots of examples like that. That is one of the challenges. Denise, your thoughts on this challenge? You spent a lot of time thinking about how to frame the discourse and how to move a criminal justice system that, as Rachel's title says, does have mass incarceration in a way that we're actually focusing on who really needs to be in jail as opposed to just keep doing what we've been doing.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of go along with that story a little bit, or with that line of thinking that Rachel brings to the forefront. And it's interesting that I think the ACLU finds itself in this place, especially on the policy side, where we really want to bring policy forward in a bold way, but recognizing, of course, that a lot of these things are incremental. And at the same time, I do think those that are elected always have to kind of see, well, where's the politics? Where are the votes? And that is a real frustration. I do see, to some of the things that you mentioned, Rachel, I do see that the public is a little bit more in tune now than in the past. And I think it's George Floyd, but it's probably a lot of other things. And maybe it's because it's now the 1 in 3 that find themselves with knowing somebody that's been incarcerated, that there's a lot more attention being paid to this notion that we have an addiction to jails and prisons, and it has not kept us any safer. Most recently, there was a study that came out that showed the exact opposite. Again, this is data, but it's real, that relying on jails, especially in the pretrial context, actually makes us less safe. And so, there's actually a bill moving in the state legislature now that is saying, look, don't arrest people for every single thing. That you really should focus on those individuals that are a true risk to the safety of the public, as opposed to let's just arrest for everything, because arresting ourselves, we can't arrest ourselves out of any of these problems. And I think that what we feel is, look, we got the data, and then we don't get the movement because we need 33 votes in one chamber, we need 18 in the other, and we're busy counting the votes. And we've kind of done a little bit more to step back and try to change hearts and minds a little bit more and bring community with us. And I think that's been a big help. I'll also add to your list, Rachel, of individuals that can be real supportive of change are survivors, victims of crimes themselves. One of the things in this particular piece of legislation that we're pushing forward, we actually have a victims group who was in support, and then we have other victims groups they're neutral, we're okay. And individuals that are survivors of crime have come out in favor of a bill that says don't arrest everybody. We're okay if you don't arrest everybody. And I think there's a really significant and impactful role that individuals in groups like that can really do a lot to change hearts and minds.
Denise, that tees up a question that I had that Don Bright has also asked, and that is important. How do we address the school to prison pipeline which we know disproportionately affects Black and brown teenagers. And I'm going to add, Denise, some flavor based on what you said. How do we use more restorative justice approaches, which often are what victims want, as opposed to overly punitive ones that we very quickly label someone and treat someone as a teenager as a criminal and railroad their future?
Well, I think the whole notion of arresting kids is even, I mean, that's just to me kind of crazy. I think that, again, with this tough on crime narrative that we've been building and working on for so long, and now we have police officers in schools, and that's problem number one. And so then if you step back and you say, oh, but we want to take police out of schools, then it's like, oh, that means a student can sexually assault another, and there's no, it's almost as if they try to tell the public, I think it's fear mongering more than anything else, that now this individual will go unpunished. Well, that's not true. There are ways to handle criminal behavior in any context, whether it's in the school or in the public or wherever. And so I think, number one, we have to, again, rethink police, rethink police role, reimagining police role in schools. And I would say we don't need them at all. And then secondly, we have to look about how we do over criminalize, as opposed to this is just bad behavior, and treating it as bad behavior as opposed to a criminal offense. Because that's another area where, again, we've just over criminalized so many things, and it's hard to distinguish. Because I think what we have seen is that sometimes, or oftentimes, when police do get involved, then there is an offense, either for resisting arrest or for fighting back with a, so then it does start to escalate, and you really set up that kid basically to fail. And that's a wrong approach. So restorative justice, of course, restorative justice, but also let's rethink whether there's any need for criminal legal system involvement at all. And then turn to, if so, how can we make it right for both the victim of the crime as well as the offender, especially when you're talking about kids whose brain development is not even close to being a real thoughtful adult.
Rachel?
Yeah, I agree with Denise, and I'll just pick up on it. I mean, this is one of those things. I bet anyone who's the parent does not need us to tell you that the brain of your child and your teenager is not fully developed. They don't do a good job assessing risk. They're not good at thinking about long-term consequences. They are really susceptible to peer pressure and group dynamics, and all of this. We have brain scans and things to show us is true. Up till somebody is about 25 years old. So, we're talking about a population of people who truly are not yet fully formed moral thinkers and actors in that way. And so to treat them like adults is just shameful in a society, that should be enlightened, and really try to ask ourselves, what can we do for these kids so they succeed? And one of the worst things we could do would be to put them in a criminal justice system where if they are locked up, they're going to be locked up with a lot of people who have a lot of mental health issues or prone to anger and violence, and you put them in that environment. And if they didn't have a problem with those things before, all of a sudden they will now. It's the worst possible place to put them. And the only other thing that I think is important for people to know is, the things people do when they're young with those brains that aren't, fully mature, that's not the same person they're going to be when they're 30 and when they're 40. And yet, we often see sentences given to young people that suggest that, they should be locked away for decades. And none of that comports with, I think, common sense for anyone who's been around young people, or even if you think in your own life, mistakes you made when you were younger, those are not decisions you'd make today. So the idea that we don't think about children differently it's a real shameful thing. And it's also terrible for public safety, because really, if what you want is to keep all of us safer, then you need interventions that are going to help those kids succeed and not do the kinds of things that is going to make it more likely that they'll be incarcerated for a while and maybe maybe they'll hook up with a gang while they're incarcerated, or, you're taking them out of school. And now when they do come back out, you've interrupted their education and you've set them up for failure. So a lot of the things that we do that, may serve some kind of short-term desire that looks like it's helping, like, let's just quickly deal with this problem by locking somebody away. 95% of the people that we incarcerate come back out, they rejoin us. And we're often putting them in situations where we're setting them up to be in real trouble when they come back, that they're not set up to do well. It's just the opposite. So with school to prison kinds of things, there's so many interventions that we know work better to keep us all safe and to give these young people a chance to succeed. So, and it's also taking a burden away from law enforcement. As we talk more about policing, I think one thing to keep in mind is that we ask police officers to do an awful lot. And, they did not sign up to be patrolling schools in that way. They're not experts with those age groups. We're putting them in a place that they really don't belong and doesn't make the most of their professional training either. So, that's one of those situations that I think we're just doing something that no one who looks at it for any length of time would think is a good idea.
So 3 points. First, what Rachel just said is also a preview for our conversation on pretrial reform and on reentry. These short-term, overly punitive decisions that have long-term negative consequences for individuals and for public safety. Second, during my campaign to be Attorney General, I had a very stark and arresting contrast, which is I went to Aurora, where I heard about a lot of these criminal citations that were being given out. And this was a very painful conversation because it had the consequences Rachel talked about. And then the second meeting I had was in Boulder, where the superintendent said, we're not going to ever give criminal citations to our students because that will stay with them for their lives and have long-term consequences. And I thought, what's wrong with this picture? And by the way, yes, the demographics of Boulder versus Aurora have quite a different racial element. And so that added to the pain of that split screen picture. And then third, one thing we're working on, and we announced a partnership with United Health Group, a major outdoor education diversion alternative for kids who get in trouble. When a kid gets in trouble, often they're having trauma that's going on. So try to put them in an environment to help them overcome their trauma and find constructive outlets rather than be quick to take a punitive approach, which has exactly the problem Rachel mentioned. So we've got a lot of directions we can go in from here. Let me get to a foundational point, Rachel. You've talked a lot about data and doing what the data tells us, whether it's crack cocaine or incarcerating young people. How do we collect and follow the data? Who does this well? You've mentioned this point about institutions. What does a strong institutional repository of data look like?
Yeah, so we know some stuff pretty well. So I don't want to suggest we know everything, right? And I want to be really careful about that. There are some things that, like I couldn't give you the magic number of years that's just the right amount of incapacitation, and deterrence, like things like that were, it's just not available to us. But there are some things that we know really well. So for example, that people age out of crime. It's called the age crime curve. And anyone who studies criminology will tell you there's just reams of data and studies on this. It is so well established. It's kind of a foundational principle. So there are certain things like that we know well. For other studies, it's a mix of who does these kinds of things. The hope is that everybody who's administering criminal laws is making sure what they're doing works. And that's not always the case, but there is a way for prosecutors' offices, police departments to partner with researchers to make sure that the policies they're pursuing work. We've got good foundations that are out there. So I'll give you one example would be thinking about pretrial detention, which we've mentioned before, right? There's a kind of, I think, intuitive sensibility that if you just think about it for a minute, you just think, well, yeah, we got to just lock people up before they go to trial, because what if they do something dangerous, right? Let's just err on the side of safety. Putting aside that you have, you're presumed innocent, there may be some real fundamental due process concerns you have with it, but let's say all you cared about was public safety, right? And you might think, let's detain people pre-trial. We've now had people study this, as Denise mentioned, right? So we could actually, what if we look at two people who are identically situated, they've both been charged with the same crime, they both have similar records, and we get large numbers of these kinds of people, and we ask, what happens to the people who are detained pre-trial? What about the people who are released pre-trial, but they're otherwise the same people? We have studies like that now, where we can look at it, and when you analyze that data, what you find are the people who are detained are more likely to commit crimes when they get back out. And if you think about it, actually, it starts to make sense, right? If I am going to detain somebody pre-trial, that person's going to lose their job, right? They are probably going to lose their housing. They're going to get evicted because they don't have money to pay the rent. They lose custody of their children, right? Their life is completely upended, even if it's a short period of pretrial detention. So when they do make it out, what world do they come back to, right? It's complete chaos, and you're really setting it up for a really difficult reentry for them. Even if they're found innocent, right? It's just the detention itself is so disruptive. Whereas if you try to maintain people's life so they can keep working, right? They can keep taking care of their children, they stay in housing, you enable them to be on a path to law-abiding behavior. So those kinds of studies, we have them done by criminologists, by foundations that support criminal justice research, big foundations like MacArthur and Vera, they do great work. So there's a lot of good data on that. We have good data on sentencing from various governmental sentencing commissions around the country. So there's a lot out there. We could be doing more. One black box in our criminal justice system tends to be prosecutors. We tend to know less about them than some other things. So it's a little harder to know which of their policies work and don't work. But even there, we're starting to learn more because we have some prosecutors around the country who've decided they want to learn more about their office and what works. So, someone like Kim Fox in Chicago is doing a full transparent data analysis of what's working and not working in her office. So it could either be government led by the actor who's in a position of authority and power, partnering with foundations, partnering with researchers. And we should all want it because at the end of the day, we want what works as opposed to what might be a gut instinct or just kind of an intuitive sensibility. Because unfortunately, sometimes our intuitions are wrong.
Denise, I'm going to let you talk about data. Anything you want to add to that? And then let's segue to pretrial from there.
Yeah, no, I was just going to add that I think you're just because of the last point you made, Rachel, that sometimes you're absolutely right what your comment was. But what I also find really fascinating is that sometimes the data proves something that we already knew. Like we just it comes up in maybe more obvious areas. For example, we know racial profiling happens. Okay, we just know. But we've never had a really, really robust data collection on it. And Colorado did pass a bill recently that will require of law enforcement officers for stops and searches to take certain demographic data. And I predict, right, that the data is going to show something that we have already known. But you need the data in order to really have good policies that might go at addressing the problem of profiling in this instance or other things. Another area that there's been a lot of really, really good data collection, since you mentioned, Phil, that we're going to go to the pretrial detention pieces, there's always been this common myth that if you post money bond, if there's money on the table, then you got skin in the game and you're going to show up for your next court appointment. When in fact, data now tells us that that the appearance rate in court does not vary whether you have put down money bond or whether you have put down a personal recognizance bond, which means just a promise that I'll show up. And there's no difference. That's what the studies tell us. That's what the evidence, and that's, there's one that's very, very Colorado specific on that point. And yet there is still this either refusal to accept that data or it's just that you just can't convince people from that entrenched view that, boy, we need money bond to make sure that people come to court and to make sure that they don't commit another crime, despite what the evidence says. So, but it probably goes back to the first point, the very, very first question, Rachel, is that you're not going to persuade people exclusively by the data. You got to have the other things.
So, Rachel, on pretrial, what jurisdictions have done this well, implement what you have very well explained, people should be allowed out on a personal recognizance bond, not kept because they're poor, if there's no risk that they're going to really harm public safety. You've explained the benefits. They don't lose their job. They're not apart from their kids. I think the studies have shown, back to data, that keeping people in longer than 48 hours or 72 hours starts to increase the likelihood they'll commit future crimes. Who has taken that and translated effectively into policy change?
Yeah. So, the first thing I think it's good for people to just know is we're the only country, us and the Philippines, who use cash bail on earth. So, I always think it's just worth a little bit of a perspective. Every other country on earth is operating just fine without cash bail. It's just us in the Philippines at this point. And if you ask yourself, what a weird way to think about public safety, because you can imagine someone who's well-to-do, who's actually quite a danger, but they can pay money. And you can imagine someone who's not a danger at all, but they're just too poor to pay even a very small amount of bail. So it's just a terrible correlation for danger. Money is just an awful surrogate. So I would tell people to look to a place like New Jersey, which I don't say very often. I'm not a huge fan of my neighboring state, but by golly, New Jersey has done a good job when it's come to bail reform. And they have, for all intents and purposes, gotten rid of cash bail there. They use it really rarely, and they have. It started in 2017. They have reduced their pretrial jail population by more than 40%. With no increase in crime. There was an initial phase there where, the opponents, which is mostly the bail bonds industry, and I get it, I always feel bad for any industry that's about to be closed up. People are going to lose their jobs and they're fighting to keep them. And so in their effort to do that, they tried to scare people. They said, you're going to do this. And, and they went around looking for cases that they could put in the media, like, this is a result of this bail change. It didn't work though. And, when you look at the data, there's no increase in crime from this. All it's done is save New Jersey a ton of money. It's lowered their pretrial population. It's not perfect, right? When you use cash bail, we see all kinds of racial disparities as a result of that. Getting rid of cash bail does not get rid of racial disparities. I wish I could say that was a magic bullet. New Jersey still has problems with that, but it didn't make it worse, right? So as I look at it and I think in the world of what's possible, it didn't increase disparities, even though it doesn't look like it reduced them, at least that stayed constant. It dramatically lowered the pretrial population. It saved New Jersey money, and everyone is safe as a result. It hasn't done anything to increase anybody's risk. So, that is a government success story that I would hope other jurisdictions will look at. And I think we're slowly starting to see that. We're starting to see other places do more to get rid of cash bail. Philadelphia is using less cash bail, Chicago, Kentucky. So it's starting to come up in different places. The key is making sure that people follow it. New Jersey has what's called a unified court system. And so the chief justice there can basically make all the judges do this kind of new policy. And so they have perfect implementation. And that's been a tricky thing in some other places. Judges haven't loved it. And in part, they haven't loved it when it's been tried in other spots because a lot of these judges are elected. And, the one thing they don't want is they release somebody and that person commits a crime that makes the paper, and now all of a sudden the judge is worried about reelection, and same for some of the prosecutors. So again, it's the politics of it. But if we put the politics aside, we just look at the data, it's a success story to get rid of cash bail, and every place should do it.
Though, Rachel, what's interesting about what you just said, though, is that you could have the judge who put money bail on somebody and they go and commit a crime. I mean, somehow the consequence doesn't follow in that situation as much as it does for the individual without money bail, even though it can happen in either scenario. It really is not logical.
Well, I think what it is actually is, I often say we have two parties in this country, the party of inertia and the party of innovation. And I'm in the party of innovation. A lot of politics are not Democrats versus Republicans. It's inertia versus innovation. And to your point, Denise, doing things the way they've always been done, there's not as negative a consequence. No one got fired for buying IBM. But if you're going to change the system and it might have a negative consequence, by gosh, people are going to be looking to criticize you for it. I want to go to a related point because we're talking about poverty. Something Denise and I are working on here in Colorado, suspending driver's licenses for unpaid court fines and a cycle of poverty that the criminal justice system accelerates. This is a three-prong lose, and we have it because of inertia. We're going to get rid of it if Denise and I have our way in Colorado. One, it's bad for public safety because when you try to revoke a driver's license from somebody, you put more work on law enforcement to do it. And if it's not about their risk on the road, you're diverting law enforcement resources for effectively going after people who aren't a risk. Second, you take someone's driver's license away, you make them drive illegally, or they can't drive. That actually makes it harder for them to get to work, which is going to put them in a deeper hole. And third, from a kind of fair, and that's just not fair. And then third, San Francisco ended this policy. They got more money in unpaid fines the year after they changed it because it's not actually driving payments. It's just digging people in a hole. So let me ask you the question, Denise, why is it taking so long to fix this?
It's all about money and revenue. And I think for a very, very long time, we have paid for the criminal justice system by the people, by putting more and more fines and fees on individuals, regardless of their ability to pay. And that's how we're financing our criminal legal system. And that is precisely what is the case here in the state of Colorado. If you take away the power to revoke a person's driver's license, well, then state judicial says, then we have no hammer and we won't be able to collect our fines and fees, despite the fact that they have about a little over 50% collection rate. So clearly the hammer is not all that effective. And then similarly, if you take away the power to revoke, then no one will have to pay the the fee to reinstate their driver's license. And so now Department of Revenue says, now we're going to lose $1.5 million for that reason. And it's kind of ridiculous that that's actually part of their budget making, is how many people are going to revoke their driver's license, get their driver's license revoked, and then come and do a reinstatement. And then that we get to add that to the revenue column. And I think we have to stop looking at financing these systems on the backs of individuals that cannot pay for them. I'll add that in the driver's license context, it's not, there is a question of whether or not it's even constitutional to revoke a person's driver's license without doing any analysis of the ability to pay. That's questionable of whether or not that's legitimate under the due process and the equal protection clause. So I think there's, lawsuits are not cheap. So that ought to be part of the equation. And on this practice of driver's license revocation, we're now seeing it happen. It's not just in blue states where states are stopping the practice. I mean, it is happening on a pretty good basis nationwide, from places like Nebraska and Virginia and Michigan, and hopefully Colorado will follow in suit. It's counterproductive, it's draconian, and it really, again, has no evidence based to really support the reasons for doing it in the first instance.
Rachel, any comments on this topic or the issue about poverty in the criminal justice system?
No, I applaud you for what you're doing. I think, again, if we're just thinking, we want people working and we want them to be able to get to their jobs. And in order for them to do that, in a lot of places, you need to drive. And so if you put people in this horrible quandary of what do I do? Do I drive on my suspended license to get to my job or not? Again, if the goal is public safety, you want to set people up to succeed. And using the fines and fees of unpaid licenses, I can't think of a more regressive tax in terms of how we're thinking about how you want to run your system. And it's also kind of ridiculous because ultimately when people are incarcerated for that, for driving on the suspended license, it costs a lot of money to incarcerate people. So when some of these fines and fees have been analyzed on kind of their net effect on state budgets, they're actually ridiculous they're losing cost propositions, right? It's actually not good government. It's just one agency thinks it's good for them, but it's actually not good for voters. It's not good for you and your overall state budget to have a policy in place like this one. And that's why Denise is right. This is not a red state, blue state, Republican, Democrat kind of thing. This is just, it was a terrible idea. And, it grew out of a time period when we were just throwing collateral consequences at people for convictions for anything. And it was just a part of the war on drugs. If you do drugs, you lose your public housing, you lose your driver's license, you lose, your benefits to food stamps, you lose everything. And it was a kind of anger at people using drugs, and no one stopped to think, is that going to make it more likely that people will succeed? And as soon as you ask that question, it becomes really obvious, well, those are terrible policies, right? You want to set people up to succeed. And so I hope you both are successful in this quest.
Me too.
Amen. Let me mention another issue where data and justice are strongly on our side, but we're fighting inertia and some of the punitive mindset you just focused on. It's reentry. Too many people leave prison in Colorado with a plastic bag, whatever number it is, $60 or something, and are homeless the next night. That is not an uncommon occurrence. The chances that someone leaves prison and is out of prison 3 years later is only 50% in Colorado, which puts us, I think, in the bottom quartile of states. So we are looking at a challenge that I'm going to lean into. How can we change this equation by supporting better reentry options? I'll give you one example in Colorado. The Second Chance Center is now showing, the word is recidivism rates, likely someone is back in prison, within 3 years of 10%, as opposed to the normal 50%. Because they start by telling people, I believe in a better future for you, and help people find jobs and housing. If you have a job, you have housing, your likelihood of ending up back in prison is markedly less than if you're at risk and not necessarily having a job or housing. So first from sort of thematic and then down to some specific, call it policy interventions, how do we change this equation? Rachel, what's the best you've seen? What do you recommend on this reentry equation that is both better for people, those leaving the criminal justice system, and also better for public safety?
Yeah, I think it starts with what happens to people while they're incarcerated. So I would put the time frame a little earlier. Instead of just viewing that as a time period to kind of warehouse somebody and wait for them to come back out, there's all kinds of interventions we could do while people are incarcerated. Vocational training that we know is a good idea. There's various kinds of cognitive behavior treatment that can get at some underlying issues that may be the reason why people commit crime in the first place. Substance abuse treatment, mental health. So there's a whole host of things that we should be doing while people are incarcerated to get at some of those root cause problems that lead people to criminal behavior in the first place. And then when people are coming out, as you said, you really want to have a reentry plan for people. You really want to think about, what's the next step? Where are you going to live? That's like number one. You got to think about where are you going to be staying? And we know that huge populations of people coming out of prisons are homeless within 6 months. It's an enormous problem. And so housing needs to be a top priority, because if you don't have housing, it's really hard to get a job, maintain a job. You're putting someone in a really tough situation. So the thing I would emphasize is that it's cheaper to set people up in transitional housing and help them find a job than it is to have them go back into prison. It's very expensive to run prisons, right? We would be way better off if we can close some of them. And so to take that money and invest it instead in these other things is what we should really be trying to do. And so, part of that is just thinking about how your state and local actors, how their budgets interact. Part of the problem tends to be things like, well, your local prosecutor doesn't pay for prison. So they they're just putting more and more people in prison, and they're not necessarily thinking about it because that's a state budget item. But really, we want fewer people going in the first place, because again, it's disruptive. It's setting up this whole chain of things. And it would really be in everyone's interest to make those investments in the transitional kinds of things. So we could start closing facilities, so we could downsize them and save some money on them. It's a heavy lift though, politically. I can't sit here and tell you that that's like a popular group when you say, we're going to provide housing there's all kinds of people struggling with housing, including people who've never committed any crimes. And so, you immediately run into a problem with voters where they say, why of all people are you helping the person, who violated the law, as opposed to this law-abiding person who's also struggling with housing, and I think we need to get away from that zero-sum idea and really ask ourselves, look, if what we all want is public safety, then this is the kind of investment we're making for public safety. We should also help people who have housing difficulties who haven't committed crimes, but they're not really fighting for the same funds. It's our public safety budget that we're talking about. And within our public safety budget, it's better to use the money for this kind of reentry, because at the end of the day, it will help crime rates go down.
So one point I want to mention, I do think we're in a moment a year after, and this is tomorrow, the murder of George Floyd, where there is a call for equity, and there's a recognition that some of those in the criminal justice system, many of those, found their way in through all sorts of channels, school to prison pipeline, for an example, substance abuse, mental health issues, and that giving them a fair chance to succeed is the just and equitable thing to do. And so getting employers to commit to hiring people who've been justice involved is a lever that we're going to see if we can push here in Colorado some. I got a question here. Denise, you want to jump in that point for the next question?
I just wanted to add two things, I guess. One is maybe going into the process a little earlier than what Rachel was saying. I actually think part of the problem is we send too many people away for too long. So I think the length of sentences really compounds, I think, the problem for a reentry. So we have to think about length of sentencing for that purpose. And then I think the second thing I would add is when you talk about investing in some of these resources, I think it really has to be community investment. It's really not necessarily that we continue to ask what's the role of state government in doing these things, but when you fund a second chance center or you fund other local community groups that can work with these individuals, you're going to have far greater success than just checking in with a probation officer, every week or whatever the thing is, but being part of a community. And I think that's where the investment and the resources ought to go, is back into the community that have really been shortchanged for lots of reasons. And I think those two things I would just add.
So on the point that I mentioned, a year ago tomorrow was the murder of George Floyd. We got a question. I'm going to ask it, Bob May, verbatim, and then I'll start to answer it. Please talk about the training of police not to abuse Blacks. And so this is what Denise mentioned earlier. We know that bias, most notably implicit bias, but obviously there can be other forms as well, is a systemic problem in our criminal justice system. For those not as familiar with the literature, I will mention a few adjacent areas where implicit bias and inequity has been documented. School to prison pipeline, there was a study in North Carolina, African-American teachers versus white teachers making judgments about African-American students. The white teachers were close to 50% less confident that the Black students would graduate from high school than Black teachers were. A study from a sociologist tried to find jobs for two different resumes: a white individual with a criminal record, a Black individual without a criminal record. The white individual with a criminal record got the jobs more easily, which could be explained just by saying your implicit bias is so strong. You as an employer interview a Black person, you think they're a felon. You interview a white person, the resume says they're a felon, and your mind takes you the other place, which, by the way, I'm glad we passed a law in Colorado that's the ban the box law, but the implicit bias literature says that may not be enough. because in the absence of that information, people will just assume based on skin color. And we're in this difficult situation where biases by all sorts of people, healthcare profession, education profession, policing profession, has a disparate impact on the people who are subject to decisions by police. Now, how we recruit police, how we train police, how we discipline police can make a difference. I put a blog post of mine in the chat. There's a lot of work to do on this. Rachel, as we're sitting here a year after the murder of George Floyd and reflecting on this challenge, what are some of your thoughts?
Yeah, I hate to be pessimistic about some of these things, but I'm going to do it anyways, because I got to just tell you what the data shows here. We're not going to train our way out of this. We've tried training, and it unfortunately is not solving these fundamental problems. And so, I have personally, after kind of looking at everything that we've learned about policing, come to believe that one of the best things we can do is reduce the footprint of the police, to get them to the kind of core thing we really want them to do, which is deal with violence in our communities that requires an armed response. But for everything else, really think about, can we get somebody better to deal with that? So, let's start with traffic. When you think about the police engaging in kind of routine traffic kinds of things, why would we do that, right? It's kind of one of those, it sets up confrontations between the police and people that we've all too often seen turn violent, sometimes deadly. And there's no real need to do that, right? We can do things with our technology now to deal with citations that don't require those person-to-person interactions by the police. And then we can free the police up to go do other things. And, if you want to talk about bias studies, the one that has always kind of blown my mind in the worst way is that, so, you're twice as likely to be stopped if you're Black than if you're white by the police. And this is another one that there's a million studies. When you do your Colorado study, I'll bet money in the bank. Anyone want to take this bet from me? You will find it in Colorado. We have found it everywhere. But interestingly, that decreases as the sun goes down. Because as it gets darker, the police can't see the race of the driver. And so there's these fascinating studies that when they can't see the driver, we start to kind of see that go away. So when we think about traffic stops that we know have all this bias built into it, and then have all of the potentially violent interactions, to me, it says, let's get the police out of traffic enforcement, because there are alternatives. Similarly, you have someone in a mental health distress state. Why do we ask our police officers to respond to that, right? That is a terrible situation to bring a law enforcement officer into, when we could have a social service response that is better situated for the person in distress, that's better for the law enforcement officer. So, for me, I think we should be thinking about ways to reduce the policing footprint, so that we only have this armed actor from the state in those situations where we really need it, and we take them out of all of the others to the extent that we can. And that includes these minor offenses. I think we need to really rethink some of the things we criminalize in the first place. So when you think about, George Floyd, it's for passing a counterfeit $20 bill is the allegation there. Or, you think about Eric Garner was, selling cigarettes that he wasn't supposed to be selling. Some of the things that we have law enforcement respond to, it doesn't make any sense. So I'm more of the school that we need to shrink what they're doing and, target them on the things that their skills, and the reason we have an armed set of officers for makes the most sense. And so I'm all for that. I'm all for finding other ways to try to respond to things that don't involve a person who's armed coming into that situation. And I think that's what's in the interest of public safety, because every time a law enforcement officer kills somebody who's unarmed, we're all less safe. That's a public safety disaster. And so I think we should be thinking about ways to just limit what it is that they're doing.
So 3 reflections, and I'll tee up Bob's follow-up for Denise. First, Denver is now starting to do some of this. There's a program called the STAR program, having mental health responders for issues like threatened suicide. You've made that case well. Denver's, I think, having good success with that. Second, really small jurisdictions may not have this luxury. And so a challenge, Rachel, to think about is if you're in a smaller county in Colorado, can they make that model work, and what do they do? And the third point is for Denise from Bob, which is my third point is I'm not going to give up on training because we oversee the police academies, and we're going to try to rebuild the curriculum so that it's starting with ethical decision-making, empathy, not escalating situations. Those are tools we need to help people develop so they're not only approaching issues, I've got a firearm, I got to be quick to use it. But I think this is a challenge we have. Denise, a point that was made by Bob is, what about accountability for bad cops? And can you talk a little about 217 here in Colorado that we passed?
Absolutely. But I do want to capitalize a little bit on some of the things that Rachel said, because I think that in part, it is definitely, and I really, really appreciate your comments on how do we remove someone with a weapon from, an armed officer from certain, from even showing up at all, as when people are in a mental health crisis or other, and that is the STAR program that you mentioned. And then there's also, you're exactly right. I think police shouldn't be involved in civil traffic infractions. I mean, the bulk of traffic violations are not criminal. They are civil, and they do get out of control. And I think that here in Colorado, over half of the arrests that are made in Colorado are for low-level, non-violent offenses. And so there's actually a bill making its way through the state legislature that, to the extent we can't decriminalize some of these things, what we can do is rein in the discretion to arrest for these situations. And therefore, there's less likelihood for more serious confrontation. Senate Bill 217, I think the most important piece of that particular piece of legislation that passed last session was removing the defense of qualified immunity from individual police officers. What we have, and it's very wonky, and it's complicated to get into, but basically what we have in federal law is what is called a Section 1983, where you can bring a civil rights claim for the unlawful use of force by a police officer, and you would bring that claim before the courts. And what the Supreme Court did now quite a few decades ago was created this doctrine called qualified immunity. And basically what it said is, if you don't have clearly established that this particular practice is in violation of the law, well then your case cannot go forward. And so the conduct itself, you never get the constitutional issue resolved. And really, essentially what happens is that there is no accountability on the part of the police officer or the law enforcement agency itself. And so what Senate Bill 217 here in the state of Colorado did is it removed this qualified immunity piece for purposes of bringing your claim into state court. And now you can bring those claims into state court. And that is a very, very significant. We're the first state in the country now to do that. And we'll see if that does indeed bring greater accountability to law enforcement in ways that we hope that it will.
Well, Denise, don't forget, there's a second accountability measure there, which is our office oversees pattern and practice of civil rights violations by governmental entities, including law enforcement, and we're doing our first such investigation. Rachel, are you going to say something on that?
I just want to say one other thing, which is, I think the main thing we would like to, really focus, crimes of violence are the worst things. That's what we really want to reduce. And I just wanted to point out the relationship between these things, because when you have the police stopping people for things like traffic violations, and when they lead to these violent altercations or people are dying, it just ruins the trust that people have in the police, and in particularly communities of color. And that is a real problem for solving the most serious crimes, because if your interactions with the police are such that the police are mistreating you, or you feel like you are being mistreated because of all these interactions that you're having with traffic or pedestrian stops or what have you, then what we see is that cooperation with law enforcement for the serious stuff goes down. So when we start to fix these other things, I think it will improve community relationships with law enforcement. And we should aim to do that because our clearance rates for violent crimes are really low. In most cities, it's well under 50% that you're going to solve a homicide. It's well under that you're going to solve violent sexual assaults and robberies. And if you try to think, how could we improve the numbers on those kinds of crimes, using more police resources for detective work and investigation, but getting people to cooperate and help out. And the way you do that is to have a better relationship between the police and communities. And one way you do it is actually to get them out of the business of some of these things that make it hard to have good relationships with communities.
Final question that, Rachel, you want to talk about. I know we're over time, but I want to give this a final one, then we'll let Alan take it home. The progressive prosecutor movement has been an interesting development. We see a number of such cases here in Colorado, as we've seen nationally. How do you explain this phenomenon, and what does it mean to you?
Yeah, so we have dozens of these prosecutors around the country. You can give them whatever label. Sometimes they like reformist, decarceral, progressive, but the idea is it's a kind of prosecutors not running on the traditional tough on crime kind of playbook that we've seen for so long. They want to do something to reform and reduce the prison population and promote public safety by doing that. And we've seen them win elections all across the country in big cities and some smaller cities. And I think what is interesting about that is the voters who are voting for them are the people closest to how criminal law operates in America, right? Like these are the communities, if you take a place like Philadelphia, where Larry Krasner is the district attorney and he was just reelected. And he has said that the voters there in Philadelphia understand the problem because they are victims of crimes. They are people who have been victims of the system because they have been incarcerated, prosecuted, sentenced, and seen the excesses. They are police officers and law enforcement. They see the whole three-dimensional aspect of this, and they want safety in their community, and they know that the old blueprint didn't work. So they want to elect somebody who has a new vision for public safety that is going to do better than what they have seen. And I think what is interesting about it is in the places where people are experiencing the highest rates of crime, the highest rates of incarceration, they are voting for these kinds of folks. It's harder to get people like that elected when you start looking at statewide elections, when you start to bring in people in rural communities and suburban communities, because they have a different experience with the way criminal law operates. It may not be as proximate and personal. And so they may be misled by media accounts. They may not have as much information, but our most well-informed voters who are really thinking about this in a three-dimensional way are saying they want something different. And I think that it's interesting that Larry Krasner was reelected, because I do think one question mark with this was it it was kind of a new thing, but then once conservatives or folks that didn't like it kind of caught up and ran opposition campaigns, could it last? And I think it's interesting that voters are giving him another term to keep going with what he's doing. And despite media accounts that really tried to pin on him an increase in homicides, which we see, by the way, around the country with prosecutors who are progressive and prosecutors who aren't, that is a nationwide thing. It's definitely not a progressive prosecutor problem. It's something else. And I think it was good that the voters recognized that and reelected him. It's not a panacea. It's not. We need legislative reform. We need state level reform. We need great attorneys general like yourself. I only wish that we had better AGs around the country, because that's really important. And that's a different kind of office to run for in terms of the kinds of policies and things that people care about. And certainly for things like governor, state legislator, federal actors, members of Congress, the president, you get into a whole different set of voter dynamics. But district attorney, it's a one-issue election. It's just crime. And it's just the local people who are trying to figure out what they want in their communities. And I think it's really interesting that so many of those communities are saying, please give us something different, because what we've had has not worked.
Well, Rachel, Denise, I treasure both of you, and it is always a pleasure. Like Denise said, Rachel, we want you back here physically in Colorado for a real book signing. We appreciate you very much, and we appreciate the tattered cover. Alan, I think you will take us home.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm sorry for that. I had to be re-promoted as an admin. But again, thank you all very much. Professor, Denise, Phil, of course, thank you so much for your contributions tonight. This is a critical topic and one that we're eager to address in the future. Again, as we said, Rachel, you're always welcome back in Denver very soon. Just to close out, this is part of a series we're calling Tattered Cover Presents, where we confront issues facing our community in a thoughtful way with books as the secondary impact. And so look in your email tomorrow for a reading list of books that Phil has suggested as critical to this conversation for more information, more background on the topic we discussed tonight. As many of you know, Tattered Cover is going through a new ownership group where we're eager to engage more in the community and to be a haven for knowledge, community, and conversation in Denver and our region for the next 50 years as we celebrate our 50th anniversary in 2021. So we're eager for you to attend more Tattered Cover Presents series. Go to our website, tatteredcover.com, for more information about future events. But once again, it's my pleasure to thank Professor Barkow, Phil Weiser, and Denise Mays for being here. It is a pleasure. Please have a great night. Thank you again for being here. Take care.